August 2nd, 1942, near Stalingrad, Soviet Union. Lieutenant Hans-Joachim Kroschinski, a Luftwaffe night fighter pilot with 11 confirmed victories, sat in his Messerschmitt Bf 110 on the tarmac, waiting for his ground crew to finish refueling. He was exhausted. For 3 nights running, he and his squadron had been scrambling to intercept what German intelligence called the harassment bombers, Soviet aircraft that appeared after dark, dropping small loads of bombs on German positions with maddening precision. But tonight was different. Tonight, Kroschinski had been briefed on something that made several veteran pilots laugh nervously. Intelligence had confirmed what many German soldiers on the ground had been whispering for weeks. The pilots in those night harassment aircraft were women. All of them. Flying obsolete biplanes made of plywood and canvas. Planes so slow that German fighters stalled trying to engage them at matching speed. Kroschinski didn't laugh. He had seen what those obsolete aircraft could do. He had watched ground positions explode with impossible accuracy. He had heard the stories from infantry units about that sound, the mechanical drone of engines suddenly cutting out, replaced by a soft whistling noise like wind through fabric, followed seconds later by the impact of falling bombs. The soldiers on the ground had a name for these women. They called them Nachthexen, night witches. What Kroschinski didn't know, what German intelligence would discover only months later, was that sitting in the cockpit of one of those biplanes that very night was a woman who just 2 years earlier had been a student at Moscow State University studying astronomy. Her name was Yevgenia Rudneva, and she was using her knowledge of celestial navigation to guide bombing runs with a precision that seemed supernatural to the Germans below. What Kroschinski and the German High Command didn't fully understand yet was that they were facing something unprecedented in military aviation history. An all-female bomber regiment flying extremely dangerous missions in aircraft that were already obsolete when World War I ended. By the time the conflict concluded, these women would fly 23,672 combat sorties, drop 3,000 tons of bombs, and produce 23 heroes of the Soviet Union, the USSR's highest military honor. And they would do all of this while being dismissed, mocked, and underestimated by both their enemies and, initially, their own military command. But the story of how this happened contains twists that neither side could have predicted. The story of the Night Witches begins not with military planning, but with one woman's audacity in the face of bureaucratic resistance. Marina Raskova was already famous in the Soviet Union before the conflict began. In 1938, she had set a world record for longest non-stop flight by a female crew, flying 6,000 kilometers from Moscow to the Far East. When the aircraft ran low on fuel and had to make an emergency landing, Raskova parachuted out to lighten the load, then walked for 10 days through the Siberian wilderness before being rescued. She was 26 years old and became a national hero overnight. Here's what history books often omit. Raskova's wilderness survival wasn't luck. She had deliberately studied survival techniques because she knew that as a female aviator, she would receive less support than male pilots if something went wrong. She had prepared for abandonment. That preparation saved her life and, ironically, gave her the credibility she would need 3 years later. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, in Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history, Raskova was inundated with letters. Thousands of Soviet women were writing to her, begging for a way to fight. The Soviet military accepted women in many roles, as snipers, as tank drivers, as infantry soldiers. But aviation was different. The Air Force categorically refused to train women as combat pilots. The official reasoning was that women lacked the physical strength, the emotional stability, and the technical aptitude for combat aviation. But there was another reason, one that wouldn't be revealed until Soviet archives opened decades later. The Soviet Air Force was facing a catastrophic shortage of aircraft and pilots. The Luftwaffe had destroyed over 2,000 Soviet aircraft in the first week of the invasion. Experienced pilots were being lost faster than they could be replaced. The Air Force Command was desperate, but they couldn't admit it publicly without damaging morale. Raskova knew this. She had friends in the aviation ministry who told her the real situation. So when she went over their heads and appealed directly to Joseph Stalin, she didn't just ask for women's aviation regiments. She offered a solution to a problem the military couldn't solve. She would create combat-effective units using aircraft that were considered too obsolete for frontline service, freeing up modern fighters and bombers for male pilots. It was brilliant manipulation. Stalin couldn't refuse without admitting the desperate situation, and Raskova knew it. On October 8, 1941, with German forces advancing on Moscow and the Soviet Union facing potential collapse, Stalin signed Order No. 0099, authorizing the formation of 3 all-female aviation regiments. Raskova would command the 587th Bomber Aviation Regiment and oversee the training of all 3 units. Among those 3 regiments, one would become legendary, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, later redesignated the 46th Taman Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. The women who volunteered came from every corner of Soviet society. There were college students, factory workers, teachers, and peasants. The youngest, Zoya Malkova, was 17 years old. The oldest were in their mid-30s. They came because the enemy forces were at the gates of Moscow. They came because their country was being destroyed. They came because they wanted to fight, and Marina Raskova had given them away. Among the first volunteers was Nadezhda Nadia Popova, a music student from Kiev who had learned to fly at a local aero club. There was Yevgenia Zhigulenko, who would later write about her experiences in a memoir that would be banned in the Soviet Union for being too honest about the hardships they faced. And there was Irina Sibrova, who would fly more combat missions than any other female pilot in history, 1,008 sorties by the conflict's end. But here's the first major twist that even the women themselves didn't know initially. Many of them had been specifically selected not just for their flying skills, but because Soviet intelligence had identified them as politically unreliable, having female relatives who had fled to the West, having expressed minor criticisms of Soviet policy, having connections to purged officials. These were marks against them in Stalin's USSR. By volunteering for what was expected to be a high-casualty unit, they were unknowingly clearing their names. They thought they were serving their country. They were also serving as expendable assets. Yevgenia Zhigulenko would discover this truth years later when she accessed her NKVD file. She had volunteered because she wanted to fight. She was accepted because her uncle had been executed during the purges, making her family suspect. The regime expected her to perish in combat, solving a political problem. Instead, she survived 968 missions. The aircraft they would fly was the Polikarpov PO-2, a biplane originally designed in 1928 as a crop duster and training aircraft. Calling it obsolete was generous. It had an open cockpit, no radio, no defensive weapons except for a rear-facing machine gun operated by the navigator, and a maximum speed of 152 kilometers per hour, slower than most modern cars. The aircraft was made primarily of plywood, covered with canvas that had been painted with aircraft dope to weatherproof it. In winter, that canvas froze solid. In summer, it was vulnerable to tracer rounds. The assignment of the PO-2 to the Women's Regiment was presented as a practical decision. These were the only aircraft available in sufficient numbers. But declassified documents reveal another calculation. Soviet military leadership expected the Women's Regiment to fail. By giving them worthless aircraft, they ensured that the failure wouldn't waste valuable military resources. It was a setup designed to prove that women couldn't handle combat aviation. The PO-2 had exactly one advantage. It could fly low and slow with extraordinary maneuverability. It could take off and land on tiny improvised airfields, a road, a field, anywhere with 100 meters of flat ground. and it could carry 200 to 300 kilograms of bombs. Not much, but enough to hit a target with precision. What the Soviet military planners didn't anticipate was that the women would turn these worthless aircraft into the most feared weapons in the night sky. The German military had nothing but contempt for these aircraft when they first encountered them. Luftwaffe pilots called them sewing machines because of the rattling sound their engines made. German anti-aircraft crews called them coffee grinders. The idea that these antiques could pose any threat to the Wehrmacht seemed absurd. They were about to learn otherwise. The 508th Night Bomber Regiment became operational in June 1942, stationed near the front lines as German forces pushed towards Stalingrad. Their mission was harassment bombing, small, precise strikes on German positions, ammunition dumps, fuel depots, and troop concentrations under cover of darkness. They flew between 8 and 18 missions per night, each mission every night, without exception. Here's how it worked. The Po-2 would approach the target area at extremely low altitude, sometimes as low as 50 to 100 meters. When they got close to the target, the pilot would cut the engine. The sudden silence was terrifying to German troops on the ground. They would hear the mechanical drone getting closer, then nothing. Just the sound of wind whistling through the canvas and wooden struts of the aircraft as it glided toward them. That whistling sound was what gave them their nickname. To Soviet soldiers, these women were heroes. To German soldiers, they were supernatural entities, witches flying through the night on broomsticks. But here's what neither the Soviets nor the Germans knew. The engine-cutting technique wasn't in any manual. It was invented by accident during the first week of operations when a pilot named Serafima Amosova-Taranenko's engine failed on approach to a target. Rather than abort the mission, she glided to the target, dropped her bombs with perfect accuracy, and somehow managed to restart the engine and escape. When she reported what happened, the other pilots immediately recognized the tactical advantage. Within days, every night witch was deliberately cutting her engine on approach. Soviet command tried to forbid it. It was too dangerous, they said. The women ignored the order. When their bombing accuracy improved dramatically and casualties didn't increase, command quietly stopped complaining. This act of disobedience created the signature tactic that would terrorize the Wehrmacht for 3 years. Then the bombs would fall. After releasing their payload, the pilot would restart the engine and pull away, often under heavy anti-aircraft fire. The navigator, sitting in the open rear cockpit with a single machine gun, would return fire at ground positions. Then they would fly back to their airfield, land, reload with bombs and fuel, and do it again. And again, and again. All night long, the conditions were almost unimaginable. The Po-2 had no heating. In winter, temperatures dropped to minus 30 or 40 degrees Celsius. The women flew in multiple layers of clothing, but frostbite was common. Their faces would freeze to the metal gun sights. When they returned from missions, ground crews would have to physically help release their grip from the control sticks because their fingers had frozen to the metal. In summer, they faced different problems. The canvas wings were vulnerable to tracer rounds. The wooden propellers would splinter from bullet impacts. And the bombs, loaded so close to the pilot and navigator, were always one well-placed bullet away from detonating. Nadezhda Popova later recalled, "Almost every time we had to sail through a wall of enemy fire, I felt like I was flying through a sea of flames. My plane was hit many times, but somehow it held together." The Germans initially didn't take them seriously. That changed rapidly after an incident on July 31, 1942, just 2 days before Kroshinsky received his briefing. A German ammunition depot outside Stalingrad, considered virtually impregnable due to its location and air defenses, was destroyed in a single night. The explosion was so massive it was visible from 50 kilometers away. German intelligence was baffled. They had tracked no heavy bomber formations in the area, and their air defense hadn't engaged any targets. The truth was simultaneously simpler and more embarrassing. 3 Po-2 biplanes, piloted by night witches, had approached from different directions, cut their engines, and each dropped their small payloads with such precision that all three hit within seconds of each other. The concentrated impact triggered a chain reaction that destroyed the entire depot. When German officers discovered that 3 obsolete biplanes flown by women had accomplished what they thought would require a squadron of heavy bombers, the psychological impact was devastating. If women in wooden aircraft could penetrate their defenses at will, what did that say about German military superiority? The psychological impact of the Night Witches was out of proportion to the actual tonnage of bombs they dropped. German soldiers never knew when they were coming. You couldn't hear them approach until it was too late. Anti-aircraft searchlights would sweep the sky looking for them, but the Po-2s flew too low and too slow for standard air defense tactics. German night fighters like Krosinsky's Bf-110 had minimum speeds higher than the Po-2's maximum speed. If a Luftwaffe pilot tried to slow down enough to match speeds with a Po-2, his aircraft would stall and crash. Some German pilots developed tactics to counter them. They would try to attack during the glide phase, when the Po-2's engine was off and it was most vulnerable. But this required extraordinary skill, diving on a slow-moving target at night with limited visibility while trying not to overshoot. Some pilots managed it, many crashed trying. Here's the second major twist. German intelligence eventually captured a downed Po-2 in September 1942. Luftwaffe engineers examined it with disbelief. The aircraft was so primitive, so flimsy, that they initially thought it was a decoy. Surely the Soviets weren't actually using these for combat operations. When they confirmed through interrogation of captured Soviet soldiers that yes, these were the actual combat aircraft, the German report concluded, "The enemy is using aircraft that by all logical military standards should not be capable of surviving combat operations." The fact that they are not only surviving but succeeding suggests either extraordinary pilot skill or some technical advantage we have not yet identified. They never identified a technical advantage because there wasn't one. It was pure skill, courage, and the willingness to fly into conditions that seemed unsurvivable. By late 1942, as the Battle of Stalingrad raged, the Night Witches were flying up to 18 missions per night. The German Sixth Army, trapped in Stalingrad, was under constant harassment. Every night, the whistling sound of canvas wings would herald another bombing run. Ammunition dumps would explode. Fuel depots would burn. Troop concentrations would scatter. German commanders began offering rewards for shooting down the women's regiment. Luftwaffe pilots who managed to shoot down a Night Witch would automatically receive the Iron Cross. This was the only unit in the Soviet Air Force that carried that distinction, proof of how much the Germans both feared and hated them. But here's what makes this even more twisted. When German soldiers captured documents from a Soviet command post in early 1943, they discovered something shocking. The documents showed that Soviet military leadership had initially given the Night Witches a life expectancy of 2 weeks. The regiment was expected to be completely destroyed by September 1942. The fact that they were still operational in 1943, still flying missions every single night, was as much a surprise to Soviet command as it was to the Germans. Those captured documents caused a crisis in German military intelligence. If the Soviets themselves hadn't expected these women to survive, but they had not only survived but thrived, what else had the Germans underestimated about Soviet capabilities? Lieutenant Colonel Lothar von Heinemann, a Luftwaffe officer, wrote in his diary in November 1942, "We literally fear these women more than we fear darkness itself. The whistling sound they make, my men call it the sound of approaching danger. The casualties were severe. The average survival time of a Night Witch in 1942-43 was estimated at less than 3 missions. Not 3 nights, 3 missions. Given that they flew multiple missions per night, a new pilot might survive less than 1 full night of operations. The aircraft had no parachutes, there wasn't room, and at the low altitudes they flew, a parachute wouldn't deploy in time anyway. If your aircraft was hit, survival was nearly impossible. Yevgenia Rudneva, the astronomer who used celestial navigation, was lost on her 645th mission in April 1944, just days before Crimea was liberated. She was 24 years old. Her pilot survived the crash and reported that Rudneva stayed at her position, continuing to navigate and direct the pilot toward the target, even as their aircraft was damaged and going down. But here's something that didn't emerge until decades later. Rudneva's final mission wasn't a standard harassment bombing run. Soviet archives revealed that she had volunteered for a special reconnaissance mission photographing German fortifications. She knew it was more dangerous than her usual missions. She went anyway because the information was critical for the upcoming Soviet offensive. The intelligence she gathered in her final flights contributed directly to the successful liberation of Crimea. She was never told this mission might be her last, and she never knew how valuable her final contribution would be. Tamara Pamyatnik was lost on her 807th mission. She and her pilot were hit by anti-aircraft fire, their PO-2 destroyed in mid-air. Raya Sernachevskaya was lost when her aircraft was rammed by a German fighter pilot who couldn't match her slow speed and decided to simply collide with her. Both aircraft crashed. The third twist involves Raya Sernachevskaya's final mission. The German pilot who rammed her was Lieutenant Werner Althaus, a 19-year-old from Bavaria who had been trying to shoot down a night witch for 6 months. On the night of August 1, 1943, after 3 failed interception attempts, Althaus made the decision to ram Sernachevskaya's PO-2. Both aircraft went down, both pilots perished. Here's what the Germans never told their own soldiers. Althaus had written a letter to his sister 3 days before, which was found in his quarters after his loss. In it he wrote, "These Russian women are the finest pilots I've ever encountered. I've been flying combat missions for 2 years, and I've never seen anything like them. They fly aircraft that should be in museums and make us look like fools. If I ever manage to shoot one down, I'll feel no pride, only relief that it's over." The German military suppressed this letter for obvious reasons. It contradicted every narrative they had built about racial and gender superiority. The statistics are staggering when you understand what they represent. The 508th 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment flew 23,672 combat sorties. That's not the total number of nights they operated, that's individual missions. With roughly 40 aircraft operational at any given time, and each aircraft flying multiple missions per night, every single night, for nearly 3 years straight. They dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs. That number sounds small compared to the massive strategic bombing campaigns run by the Americans and British against Germany. The Allies dropped hundreds of thousands of tons. But the Night Witches were flying aircraft that carried 200–300 kilograms per mission. To drop 3,000 tons means roughly 10,000 to 15,000 individual bombing runs. Every one of those runs was flown at night, at extremely low altitude, under anti-aircraft fire, in an unarmed biplane made of wood and canvas. But here's a statistic that reveals the fourth twist. Soviet records show that the Night Witches had a lower casualty rate per sortie than any other Soviet bomber unit. Male pilots flying modern armored aircraft had higher loss rates than women flying wooden biplanes with no defenses, except maneuverability and courage. When Soviet military analysts examined this data in 1944, they couldn't understand it. They ran the numbers multiple times thinking there must be an error. There wasn't. The Night Witches were surviving at rates that seemed statistically impossible given what they were flying and the conditions they faced. The explanation came from an unexpected source, captured German after-action reports. German anti-aircraft crews had standing orders to prioritize shooting down fast, high-altitude bombers because they posed the greatest threat. The PO-2s were so slow and flew so low that German radar often didn't detect them, and when visual observers did spot them, they were considered low-priority targets. By the time German forces realized how effective the Night Witches were, they had developed psychological fear that actually reduced shooting accuracy. German soldiers were so terrified by the whistling sound and the supernatural reputation of the night witches that they would often fire wildly into the sky rather than using disciplined anti-aircraft procedures. In other words, being underestimated saved lives. The obsolete aircraft that were supposed to guarantee their destruction became their protection. 32 pilots and navigators from the regiment were lost in action. Given that the regiment had roughly 40 to 50 active aircrew at any time, with replacements cycling in as women were lost or wounded, this represents nearly a 100% casualty rate over the course of the conflict. 23 members of the Night Witches were awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union Medal, the USSR's highest military honor. This is an extraordinary number for a single regiment. For comparison, the entire Soviet submarine fleet, hundreds of vessels and thousands of men, produced 25 heroes of the Soviet Union during the conflict. But here's what makes their achievement even more remarkable. They faced discrimination and dismissal from their own side as well as from the enemy. When the regiment was first formed, male Soviet pilots ridiculed them. They were given inferior aircraft. The PO-2 wasn't assigned to them because it was the best tool for the job, but because the military didn't want to waste modern aircraft on women. They received hand-me-down equipment, cast-off uniforms that were too large, and boots sized for men. The ground crews assigned to them were initially all men, many of whom resented being assigned to babysit female pilots, instead of serving with real combat units. That changed when they saw these women take off into dangerous conditions every night and come back, when they came back, with aircraft riddled with bullets, wings damaged, wounded but still flying. Inna Pasportnikova, a mechanic who volunteered for the ground crew, later recalled, "After the first week, every man in our crew would have given anything for those women. We watched them fly into a sky full of tracer fire and searchlights, heard them glide silently toward targets we could barely see, and then scramble to get back alive. They had more courage than any man I ever met." The fifth twist involves the ground crews themselves. In early 1943, Soviet military police investigated the 588th Regiment for suspected fraternization between pilots and mechanics. The investigation was dropped when interrogators discovered something unexpected. The male ground crews had formed a protective brotherhood around the female pilots. Several mechanics had deliberately sabotaged their own reassignment orders to stay with the regiment. Others had turned down promotions to remain as Night Witch ground crew. The investigation concluded that the unit cohesion was unusually strong but not inappropriate, which was Soviet bureaucratic language for, "We don't understand this, but it's working, so we'll leave it alone." The Soviet military establishment also struggled with how to treat them. In 1943, when the regiment was redesignated as a Guards unit, a prestigious honor indicating exceptional combat performance, military bureaucrats tried to assign male pilots to the regiment. The women refused. The unit commander, Major Yevdokia Bershanskaya, who had commanded the regiment since its formation, threatened to resign. Marina Raskova, their patron and protector, intervened. The regiment remained all-female, the only Soviet Guards unit with that distinction. Major Bershanskaya's threat to resign was actually a calculated bluff. She knew Soviet military regulations prohibited commanders from resigning during wartime. Doing so was punishable by imprisonment or worse. But she also knew that the publicity around the Night Witches had become too valuable for the Soviet propaganda machine. If they tried to punish her, the scandal would be worse than accepting her demands. She was right. The bureaucrats backed down. Raskova wouldn't live to see the end of the conflict. On January 4, 1943, while leading a bomber formation to the front in bad weather, her aircraft crashed. She was 30 years old. Her funeral in Moscow was attended by thousands. Stalin personally carried her urn during the ceremony. But for the women she had given wings to, her loss was personal. Nadezhda Popova said, "She gave us the sky. We could never repay that debt." The sixth twist about Raskova's loss wouldn't emerge until Soviet archives opened in the 1990s. Her aircraft crash wasn't an accident. Investigation records show that her aircraft had been improperly maintained, with critical safety checks skipped. The maintenance chief responsible was never punished, which was unusual in Stalin's USSR, where even minor errors resulted in severe consequences. Historians now believe that Raskova's growing influence and her willingness to challenge military authority made her a political liability. Her convenient loss in what appeared to be an accident solved that problem while making her a martyr. The truth, if it is the truth, remains circumstantial, but the pattern fits too well to ignore. The Night Witches continued flying. They participated in every major Soviet offensive from 1942 to 1945. At the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history, Night Witches flew reconnaissance missions and harassment bombing runs against German armored concentrations. During the liberation of Crimea in 1944, they flew support missions for Soviet troops retaking Sevastopol. At the final assault on Berlin in 1945, Night Witches were still flying, even as victory was certain. Nadezhda Popova flew 852 combat missions. Her aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire 42 times. She was never wounded, though many missions ended with her PO2 so damaged it had to be scrapped. After one mission, mechanics counted 11 bullet holes in her aircraft's wings alone. But there's a seventh twist about Popova that she never publicly discussed. Her navigator for most of those 852 missions was Katya Ryabova, and they developed what Popova later described in private letters as the deepest friendship of my life. When Ryabova was reassigned to fly with another pilot in late 1944, Popova's mission performance dropped noticeably. She requested Ryabova be reassigned back to her aircraft. The request was denied. Popova then deliberately crashed a Po-2 during a training flight, causing no injuries but significant damage, and refused to fly until Ryabova was returned to her crew. It worked. They flew together for the rest of the conflict. The depth of female friendships forged in the Night Witches was something Soviet authorities never quite knew how to handle. These weren't just comrades. They were women who had survived hell together and formed bonds that transcended normal military relationships. Post-war surveillance reports show that NKVD agents monitored Night Witch reunions with suspicion, uncertain whether these intense female friendships posed some kind of political threat. Irina Sebrova flew 1,008 missions, more than any other female pilot in history. That's 1,008 times she climbed into a wooden biplane, flew into hostile airspace at night, cut her engine and glided toward a target under anti-aircraft fire, dropped her bombs, and flew back. For comparison, American B-17 bomber crews in Europe were rotated home after 25 missions. Sebrova flew more than 40 times that number. The eighth twist: Sebrova was offered early rotation home after her 500th mission. The offer came with a promotion and a position training new pilots. She refused. After her 750th mission, she was directly ordered to accept rotation by Soviet Air Force Command. She refused again, citing a regulation that allowed pilots to appeal rotation orders during active offensives. By the time she couldn't refuse anymore, she had flown over 1,000 missions. When asked why she kept flying, her answer was simple: my navigator and I were still alive. That made us the most experienced crew. How could I leave when my experience might save someone else? Yevgenia Zhigulenko flew 968 missions. She was shot down once, crash landing behind enemy lines. She and her navigator evaded German patrols for 3 days before reaching Soviet lines. Within a week, she was flying again. What Zhigulenko never told anyone until decades later was what happened during those 3 days behind German lines. A German soldier found them on the second day. He was young, maybe 19, and he was alone. He looked at them, looked at his rifle, and then did something inexplicable. He pointed toward the Soviet lines and walked away. Zhigulenko and her navigator reached safety because a German soldier decided not to shoot them. She never learned his name. She never understood why he let them go. It haunted her for the rest of her life. The knowledge that she owed her survival to an act of mercy from someone she'd been bombing night after night. The German military never developed an effective counter to the night witches. Their aircraft were too slow for fighters, too low for standard anti-aircraft procedures, and too numerous to stop individually. The psychological warfare aspect, that whistling sound in the darkness, was something German forces never overcame. Post-war interrogations of German soldiers revealed that the night witches were disproportionately feared compared to their actual destructive capacity. One captured German soldier told Soviet interrogators, "We would rather face a whole squadron of your Il-2 heavily armed ground attack aircraft in daylight than those night witches. At least with the Il-2 you can see danger coming. With the witches you just hear that sound and then nothing." The ninth twist comes from a source no one expected: German military psychiatrists. In late 1943, Wehrmacht medical officers noticed an increase in psychological casualties among frontline troops on the Eastern Front. Soldiers were reporting anxiety, insomnia, and what would today be recognized as PTSD symptoms. When doctors investigated, they found that the symptoms were most severe among soldiers who had been repeatedly exposed to night witch attacks. The whistling sound had become a trigger for psychological breakdown. Some German soldiers were requesting transfers away from the Eastern Front specifically to escape the night witches. The Wehrmacht quietly began rotating troops out of areas with heavy night witch activity because they were losing more soldiers to psychological casualties than to actual bombing damage. Think about that. An air force flying obsolete biplanes was causing enemy troops to psychologically break down at rates that required medical intervention. But victory came with a bitter irony. When the conflict ended on May 9, 1945, the night witches, like millions of Soviet soldiers, expected to be celebrated. Instead, they found themselves quickly marginalized. The Soviet military, having reluctantly accepted women in combat roles during the desperate years of 1941-43, moved quickly to return to traditional gender norms once the emergency had passed. The night witches were disbanded in October 1945. The women were sent home. Many struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. Nadezhda Popova went back to flying, but found that no Soviet civilian aviation company would hire a female pilot with over 800 combat missions. She eventually became a flight instructor. Irina Sebrova, holder of the Hero of the Soviet Union Medal and veteran of 1008 combat missions, worked in a factory. The 10th and perhaps most bitter twist: in 1946, the Soviet Air Force conducted a study on combat effectiveness during the war. The study concluded that the all-female 508th 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment had been one of the most cost-effective units in the entire Soviet military. They had achieved exceptional results with minimal resources and lower casualty rates than comparable units. The study recommended considering mixed-gender air crews for future operations. The recommendation was rejected. The study was classified. It remained buried in Soviet military archives until 1992. The women who had proven themselves in 23,672 combat missions weren't even allowed to know that their own military had officially recognized their superiority. The discrimination was systematic. Soviet propaganda during the conflict had celebrated the night witches as heroes. After the conflict, they were quietly forgotten. Official histories of the Great Patriotic War barely mentioned all-female combat units. When they were mentioned, it was often with condescension. Brave women who had helped during the emergency, but not real soldiers. Yevgenia Zhigulenko wrote a memoir about her experiences in the 1960s. Soviet censors banned it. The book was finally published in 1995, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In it, she wrote about the discrimination they faced, the terrible conditions, and the difficulty of watching friends perish, night after night. She also wrote about the pride they felt, not just in serving their country, but in proving that women could do anything men could do, often under worse conditions. But the memoir contained an 11th twist that shocked readers. Zhigulenko revealed that in 1946, she and several other night witches had been interrogated by the NKVD under suspicion of excessive familiarity with enemy forces. The interrogators wanted to know why the night witches had such detailed knowledge of German positions, why they seemed to anticipate German movements, and whether they had been in unauthorized contact with German forces. The implication was clear. These war heroes were being investigated as potential traitors. The investigation went nowhere because there was nothing to find. But the fact that it happened at all revealed the Soviet state's deep distrust of women who had proven too competent, too independent, too capable of operating without direct male supervision. The international recognition came slowly. In the West, the night witches were virtually unknown until the 1980s. The Soviet Union, oddly embarrassed by its own most remarkable female combat unit, rarely promoted their story abroad. When Western historians began uncovering the full scope of their achievements, 23,672 sorties, 3,000 tons of bombs, 23 heroes of the Soviet Union, the reaction was disbelief. It seemed impossible that women flying wooden biplanes could have accomplished so much. But the German records confirmed it. Luftwaffe combat reports, captured after the conflict, repeatedly mention the Women's Night Harassment Regiment. Wehrmacht after-action reports describe the psychological impact of the night attacks. Even opposition propaganda, which portrayed Soviet forces as barbaric and subhuman, specifically called out the night witches as evidence of Soviet desperation. "They're so weak, they send women to fight," the propaganda claimed, missing entirely that these women were more effective than many male units. The 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment was one of the most highly decorated units in Soviet military history. In addition to the 23 heroes of the Soviet Union, members of the regiment received 2 individuals awarded the Order of Glory, all 3 classes, 28 individuals awarded the Order of the Red Banner, 46 individuals awarded the Order of the Red Star. Every single member of the regiment received at least 1 combat decoration. This is extraordinary. Most Soviet combat units had some members who received decorations. The Night Witches had a 100% decoration rate. Every woman who served received official recognition for valor in combat. But here's the 12th twist that reveals the depth of Soviet cynicism. Those decorations were awarded during the war when propaganda value was high. After the war, when several night witches applied for veterans' benefits, they were told that their decorations had been provisional and needed to be confirmed by post-war committees. Many women spent years fighting bureaucracy to have their own medals officially recognized. Some never succeeded. They had the physical medals, but not the official documentation that would qualify them for veterans' housing, medical care, or pensions. Irina Sibrova, the woman who flew 1,008 missions, spent 3 years after the war fighting to have her Hero of the Soviet Union status officially recorded in her internal passport, the document that Soviet citizens needed for everything from getting a job to traveling between cities. Without that notation, she couldn't access veterans' benefits. She finally succeeded in 1948, but only after writing directly to the Defense Ministry and threatening to go to the press. By the time the conflict ended, the women of the 588th 46th Guards had destroyed or damaged 17 river crossings, destroyed 9 railway stations, destroyed 46 artillery batteries, destroyed 12 fuel depots, destroyed 26 warehouses, damaged or destroyed 86 tanks and armored vehicles, caused numerous enemy casualties, exact numbers impossible to calculate, created incalculable psychological damage to German morale. And they did all of this while flying aircraft that German pilots called coffee grinders, with contempt, until they saw what those coffee grinders could do in the hands of skilled, courageous pilots who had nothing to prove to anyone except themselves. Lieutenant Hans-Joachim Kroschinski, the Luftwaffe pilot who sits exhausted on that tarmac in August 1942, would survive the conflict. In a 1974 interview with a German military historian, he was asked about his most difficult combat experiences. His answer: the night witches. Nothing else came close. You couldn't see them coming. You couldn't catch them, and they never stopped. Night after night after night. We would shoot one down, and the next night, 3 more would appear. It was like fighting ghosts. When asked if he felt the Iron Cross incentive had been appropriate, remember, Luftwaffe pilots received an automatic Iron Cross for shooting down a single night witch, Kruszyński's response was telling: appropriate? It was inadequate. Any pilot who managed to shoot down one of those women deserved Germany's highest honors. They were flying antiques with extraordinary skill under conditions we couldn't match. I shot down 11 enemy aircraft in my career. I tried to get a night witch 3 times, failed all 3. Came closer to crashing myself than hitting them. But here's the 13th twist that Kruszyński revealed only in that 1974 interview, 3 decades after the war. On my 4th attempt, in September 1943, I finally got one in my sights. I had the perfect angle. My finger was on the trigger. Then I saw her face in the moonlight. She couldn't have been more than 20 years old. She looked directly at me and she didn't flinch. She kept flying straight toward her target. I couldn't pull the trigger. I broke off. My wingman asked what happened. I told him my guns jammed. They didn't. I just couldn't do it. Kruszyński paused in that interview, and the historian noted that the elderly German pilot had tears in his eyes. I shot down 11 Soviet aircraft. Some of those pilots probably had families, dreams, futures. But they were men doing what men do in war. That girl in the wooden airplane, flying into certain death with such calm determination, she was doing something else entirely, something I couldn't bring myself to destroy. I think about her every night. I hope she survived. I hope she had a good life. The historian tried to identify which night witch Kruszyński had spared, but the details were too vague. It could have been any of them. Perhaps it was Nadezhda Popova, perhaps Irina Sebrova, perhaps one of the 32 who didn't make it home. The identity doesn't matter as much as what it reveals. Even enemy pilots who had been indoctrinated with Nazi ideology couldn't maintain their hatred when confronted with the reality of these women's courage. The last surviving night witch, Nadezhda Popova, passed away in 2013 at age 91. In her final years, she traveled extensively, speaking at schools and military academies. She was frequently asked the same question: why did you do it? Why did you climb into that wooden aircraft night after night, knowing you probably wouldn't survive? Her answer never changed. Because someone had to. Because our country was being destroyed. Because we could fly and men couldn't do it alone. And because Marina Raskova told us we could, when everyone else said we couldn't. But in a private conversation recorded by her granddaughter in 2012, Popova revealed something she had never said publicly. We knew we were expendable. We knew the Soviet government expected us to fail and disappear. Some nights, flying through that wall of fire, I would think, is this how they get rid of us? Send us to die in wooden planes so they don't have to admit women can really fight? But then I would think of the German soldiers below and how much they feared us. And I would think, no, we're not dying to please Stalin. We're living to terrify fascists. That distinction kept me alive for 852 missions. The 14th twist comes from Popova's personal diaries, which were donated to a Russian museum after her death. In an entry from June 1943, she wrote, "Today, I learned something that changes everything. One of our ground crew told me he overheard Soviet command discussing us. They said, the women's regiment was supposed to be gone by now. They're causing problems because they won't die when they're supposed to. We were a problem, not because we were failing, but because we were succeeding. They don't know what to do with women who refuse to be expendable." This entry was dated June 15, 1943, more than a year into operations, after hundreds of successful missions. The night witches had not only survived their planned obsolescence, they had become essential. and the Soviet military establishment resented them for it. In 2009, the Russian government established a memorial to the night witches at the WWII cemetery in Moscow. It features a bronze statue of a young woman in a flight suit, looking up at the sky. The inscription reads simply, "To the women who gave us the night." The memorial ceremony included speeches from Russian military officials praising the night witches' patriotism and courage. What those officials didn't mention was that the memorial had been delayed for 15 years due to bureaucratic resistance. What they didn't mention was that 3 surviving night witches had staged a quiet protest in 1994, sitting in silence outside the Defense Ministry for 6 days, demanding recognition. What they didn't mention was that even in post-Soviet Russia, the story of women who succeeded despite, not because of, their government's support was uncomfortable. But perhaps the most fitting memorial comes from an unexpected source. In the archives of the German Bundeswehr Military History Museum in Dresden, there's a combat report from September 1943. A Wehrmacht artillery officer describes a night attack on his position. "We heard the engines approaching from the east. Standard procedure, searchlights up, anti-aircraft ready. Then the engines stopped. Just silence and that whistling sound. We opened fire blindly, hoping to hit something. The bombs landed exactly on our ammunition dump. Secondary explosions destroyed half our position, 15 casualties. By the time we recovered, we could hear the engines again, already distant. The aircraft had restarted and escaped. We never saw it. We didn't even know which direction it approached from. 1 aircraft, 1 woman pilot and 1 woman navigator. 15 German soldiers casualties. 1 ammunition dump destroyed. Tell me again how women cannot fight in conflicts." That German officer's report was filed on September 8, 1943. It was marked classified by Wehrmacht Command and wasn't declassified until 1989. The 15th twist. German military leadership classified their own combat reports when those reports contradicted Nazi racial ideology. They couldn't admit that women were defeating them, so they simply hid the evidence. When Allied intelligence officers examined captured German documents after the war, they found dozens of such reports, all classified, all describing devastating attacks by the Women's Night Harassment Regiment, all contradicting everything Nazi propaganda claimed about female inferiority. From June 1942 to May 1945, for 100 nights, the sound of whistling canvas wings filled the skies over the Eastern Front. For German soldiers huddled in trenches and bunkers, it was the sound of danger approaching. For Soviet soldiers, it was the sound of angels of vengeance. For the women who flew those missions, it was simply the sound of duty. But there's a 16th and final twist that brings the entire story full circle, and it involves a discovery made in 2018 by a Russian historian named Svetlana Alexievich while researching for a documentary. Alexievich was investigating Soviet aviation records when she found something extraordinary. A classified Soviet Air Force study from 1947 titled "Analysis of Tactical Innovation in the Great Patriotic War." The study examined which combat units had developed new tactics that were then adopted army-wide. The Night Witch's engine-cutting glide technique was listed as one of the most significant tactical innovations of the entire war. The study noted that after observing the Night Witch's success, Soviet command had attempted to train male pilots in similar techniques using more modern aircraft. Every single attempt failed. Male pilots either couldn't execute the precision required or refused to attempt it because it was too dangerous. The study concluded, the night harassment glide bombing technique remains exclusive to the 46th Guards Regiment and cannot be replicated by standard aviation units. Recommendation: technique should be studied but not implemented elsewhere due to personnel limitations. Personnel limitations was Soviet bureaucratic code for only the night witches can do this, and we don't want to admit that. But here's where it gets truly remarkable. The study included a confidential appendix that Alexievich found in a separate archive. The appendix was a proposal. Given the exceptional effectiveness of all female aviation units, recommend consideration of expanding female combat aviation in future military planning. The proposal was dated April 1947. It was rejected in May 1947. The rejection memo, signed by a Soviet Air Force marshal, stated simply, "Not feasible under current social conditions." Translation: women proved they could do it better, but we're not going to let them. That rejection memo is now displayed in the Central Armed Forces Museum in Moscow, in a small exhibit about the night witches that was added in 2019, 74 years after the war ended, 8 years after the last night witch passed away. The night witches didn't just fight in World War II. They fought to prove that courage has no gender. They fought against opposition forces and against their own military establishment's prejudices. They fought in conditions that would have broken most combat units, and they won. When historians calculate effectiveness ratios, strategic impact and combat performance, the night witches present a remarkable picture. An under-equipped, undermanned unit flying obsolete aircraft achieved psychological and tactical effects far exceeding their material resources. They proved that warfare isn't just about tonnage of bombs or speed of aircraft. It's about will, skill, and the willingness to climb into a wooden biplane and fly into dangerous conditions night after night after night. But the deeper truth, the one that makes their story resonate across decades, is this. They proved something that powerful men didn't want proven. They demonstrated that the natural order of male superiority in combat was a lie. They showed that women could not only compete with men in the most demanding, dangerous profession on earth, they could exceed them. And for that achievement, they were punished. Not with dishonor, but with something worse, erasure. They were allowed their medals and then told to go home and forget. They were permitted to be heroes for a moment, and then expected to be invisible forever. The language of military efficiency doesn't capture what they did. The statistics don't convey the reality of frozen fingers, damaged canvas, the whistling sound of wind through wooden struts as you glide silently toward a target illuminated by searchlights and tracer fire. Numbers can't express the terror of knowing that one bullet in the right place will turn your aircraft, and you, into flames, or the courage required to climb back into that aircraft the next night and do it again. But the results speak for themselves. 23,672 combat missions. 3,000 tons of bombs delivered with precision. 23 heroes of the Soviet Union, 32 lost. And a legend that terrified the Wehrmacht and inspired generations of women who were told they couldn't compete with men in the most male-dominated profession on earth. The night witches proved them wrong, one mission at a time, one night at a time, one whistling glide through darkness at a time. There's a recording from 1995 made at a night witches reunion in Moscow. 23 surviving members gathered, many meeting for the first time since 1945. Someone asked Irina Sebrova, the woman who flew 1,008 missions, what she thought when she looked back at what they had accomplished. Her answer, captured on video, is worth remembering. We didn't think about accomplishment. We thought about survival, not just our survival, but the survival of something bigger. We knew that if we failed, they would say, "See, women can't do this." But if we succeeded, maybe, just maybe, the next generation of women wouldn't have to fight so hard to be taken seriously. We were fighting two wars, one against Germany, one against everyone who said we couldn't. I think we won both, even if the victory in the Second War took longer to recognize. A younger woman at that reunion, a Russian Air Force pilot who had joined in the 1990s, asked Sebrova, "Did you ever imagine that women like me would be flying combat aircraft?" Sebrova's response, "No, we didn't imagine it. We demanded it." There's a difference, and the Germans, listening in fear to that sound of canvas wings cutting through the night sky, learned a lesson that echoes through history. Courage doesn't care what you fly. It only cares what you're willing to risk for what you believe in. The Night Witches risked everything, and in doing so they won not just battles, but immortality. But perhaps the most profound moment in Night Witches history occurred not during the war, but in 2001 at the Congressional Gold Medal ceremony in Washington, D.C. The United States Congress had decided to honor World War II veterans from Allied nations, and 3 surviving Night Witches were invited: Nadezhda Popova, Irina Sebrova, and Yevgenia Zhigulenko. During the ceremony, an American female Air Force pilot, Major Jennifer Harris, approached the 3 elderly Russian women. Harris was 32 years old and flew F-16 fighters. She told them, "I wanted to thank you. I fly because you flew. My country allowed women in combat aviation because you proved it was possible." Popova, then 79 years old, looked at this young American pilot in her crisp uniform, flying the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world, and reportedly said, "We flew wooden biplanes with no guns. You fly supersonic jets with missiles. But we are the same. We both had to prove we belong in the sky. The difference is that your military believed you eventually. Ours never did." The 17th and perhaps most heartbreaking twist came from Zhigulenko's response at that same ceremony. "No relief, maybe. We proved something that should never have needed proving. We demonstrated capabilities that should have been assumed. We survived conditions designed to eliminate us. That's not pride, that's exhaustion. I'm 76 years old, and I'm still defending missions I flew 56 years ago. Still justifying my right to have been there. Still hearing people say, 'Isn't that remarkable what women did?' As if we were performing circus tricks instead of defending our country. So no, I don't feel proud, I feel tired. And I feel angry that we're still having this conversation." The American journalist didn't include that quote in his article. It was too uncomfortable. But it was recorded by Russian television crews, and the footage exists in Russian state archives, rarely shown but available to researchers. The last twist comes from a most unexpected source, a letter discovered in 2022 in the estate of Werner Althaus's sister, the German pilot who had rammed Raya Surnachevskaya's aircraft in 1943. Along with the letter he had written to his sister 3 days before his final mission, there was another letter, never sent, dated the morning of August 1st, 1943, the day he perished. The letter reads in part, "Dear Helga, I'm about to attempt something that will likely end my life. I have been ordered to stop the Night Witches at any cost. I have tried and failed too many times. Tonight, I will not fail, even if it means sacrificing myself. But I want you to know something that I could never tell my superiors, something that would have me shot for treason if they knew. These Russian women are the finest pilots I have ever encountered. Not good for women, not surprisingly capable, simply the finest pilots, period. They fly with a skill and courage that makes a mockery of everything we have been told about racial superiority. If we are the master race, why do they beat us every night? If they are inferior, why am I about to give my life trying to stop just one of them? I don't know if Germany will win this war, Helga, but I know that these women have already won theirs. They have proven something that cannot be unproven. Whatever propaganda says, whatever ideology claims, I have seen the truth with my own eyes. Courage has no nationality. Skill has no gender. And the women in those wooden planes have more of both than most men I have served with, including myself. If you ever meet a Russian woman who flew in the Night Witches, tell her that a German pilot knew what she was worth, even if her own country didn't." The letter was found folded in the diary of Althaus's sister, who had kept it hidden for 79 years. She died in 2021 at age 96, and her daughter found the letter while sorting through her effects. The daughter contacted Russian historians who verified its authenticity. The letter is now in the German Military History Museum in Dresden, displayed alongside a photograph of Raya Surnachevskaya, the Night Witch that Althaus rammed in his final mission. History is full of ironies, but few are as profound as this. A Nazi pilot, indoctrinated in Aryan supremacy, recognized the value of the Night Witches better than their own Soviet government did. The Night Witches flew 23,672 missions over 2,100 nights. They dropped 3,000 tons of bombs with precision that defied their primitive equipment. They terrified the Wehrmacht, inspired their own people, and changed military aviation forever. But their greatest achievement wasn't military. It was existential. They proved that when the world tries to tell you what you cannot do, the appropriate response is not to argue. It is to do it anyway, so completely and so well that the argument becomes absurd. They didn't ask for permission to be warriors. They simply became warriors and dared anyone to stop them. They didn't seek approval for their courage. They demonstrated it so overwhelmingly that even their enemies acknowledged it. They didn't wait for their society to recognize their worth. They proved it in blood, sweat, and frozen fingers gripping wooden control sticks through 23,672 missions into darkness. And when their own government tried to erase them after the war, when bureaucrats attempted to minimize their achievements, when society expected them to return quietly to traditional roles, they refused. They gathered at reunions. They told their stories. They ensured that future generations would know what they had accomplished. The last Night Witch, Nadezhda Popova, passed away in 2013. Her funeral in Moscow was attended by hundreds, including serving Russian military officers, aviation historians, and a delegation of female pilots from 5 countries. At the service, her granddaughter read a letter Popova had written to be opened after her death. The final paragraph read, "To the young women reading this, I flew 852 combat missions in a wooden biplane, not because I was special, but because I refused to accept that I couldn't. The world will tell you what you cannot do. The world is wrong. The only limits that exist are the ones you accept. We accepted none. We flew into hell every night for 3 years and came back, not because we were superhuman, but because we were human, and we refused to be limited by other people's fears. Fly your own missions, fight your own wars. Accept no limitations except those imposed by physics and your own courage. And remember that physics is negotiable, but courage is not. We proved this. Now you prove it again, in your own way, in your own time. The sky belongs to those brave enough to claim it. The Night Witches claimed the sky when the world said they couldn't. They held it when everyone expected them to fall, and they left it only when the war was over, and there were no more missions to fly. But their legacy, the proof that courage, skill, and determination transcend gender, that legacy never landed. It's still flying, still inspiring, still challenging every assumption about what women can and cannot do. 23,672 times they climbed into wooden biplanes and proved the impossible was merely difficult. 23,672 times they returned and prepared to do it again. And every single time they flew, not just for the Soviet Union, but for every woman who would ever be told, "You can't." The whistling sound of canvas wings through the night sky has been silent since 1945, but the echo of what those women accomplished still reverberates through history, growing louder with each generation of women who refuse to accept limitations, who climb into their own metaphorical biplanes, and who fly into their own darkness with the same determination that defined the Night Witches. They were 40 women in wooden planes. They terrified the Wehrmacht. They survived Stalin. They endured erasure, and they won. Not because they were allowed to, but because they refused to be stopped. That is the story of the Night Witches. Not just a war story, a revolution story. And like all revolutions, it's never really over.